Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends in our global audience, on behalf of the Berkhof Foundation and the Global Learning Hub for Transitional Justice and Reconciliation, it is my enormous pleasure to welcome you to Rethinking Climate Justice, Community Climate Action in Malawi and the Philippines from a Transformative Transitional Justice Lens. My name is Beatrix Austin, and I head the Conflict Transformation Research and the Peace Education teams at the Berkhof Foundation here in Berlin. At Berkhof, we offer over 55 years of experience in supporting and understanding conflict transformation, dialogue, and mediation in regions ranging from Somalia to Iraq, from Southeast Asia to Central Asia. We often operate close to the local and the subnational level, supporting communities and local authorities in meeting the problems that give rise to conflict and sometimes violence. In the area of climate action, which moves many communities with increasing frequency and urgency, our access to local peace builders, to mediators, and informal authorities enables us to see and to highlight on-the-ground evidence of how climate stress intersects with conflict drivers. We know if programs do not reflect how communities experience pressures like water scarcity and land degradation, they will not have meaningful impact. And that requires meaningful participation and connection, not just consultation of both communities and authorities. And it requires channels to national and international decision-making spaces. But this alone still is not enough. Our trusted cooperation in the context of the Global Learning Hub for Transitional Justice and Reconciliation, with eminent partners from across the globe, among them Asia Justice and Rights, Impunity Watch, CSVR, to name just 3 out of the 9. This trusted cooperation brings crucial and often overlooked perspective to climate and conflict action. Namely that most contemporary conflicts are embedded in a long history and legacy of past violence, oppression, and justice delayed. A bit more information on our Global Learning Hub is in the chat, so you can read up on that and visit it. But linking to the adage of Adam Kahane that true transformation requires power, love, and justice, we are advocating today to learn from communities under pressure that in their adaptive climate action, transformative justice measures play a central role. For our work at the intersection of conflict transformation, climate action, and transformative transitional justice, this is a door that opens. We're not looking at these fields as separate sectors, but as an interwoven ecosystem which requires integrated and creative solutions from the ground up. And with this, I wish us all an enlightening lunch hour for those of us who are Europe-born. I'm very proud of the accompanying publications that are seeing the light of day today, and I'm handing over to my colleague Johanna Lober, who will moderate the further proceedings.
Thank you very much, Bea, and a very warm welcome to everyone in this virtual room, also from my side. I am a senior project manager for the Global Learning Hub for Transitional Justice and Reconciliation here at Berkhof Foundation in Berlin. And I'm looking forward to guiding us through today's session. With today's event, we mark the publication of a new series of 3 papers, which, as Bea already hinted to, explore the synergies and also the potential around linking the 2 fields of transitional justice and climate justice. These papers are the product of a research collaboration within the framework of the Global Learning Hub between 2 of its partner organizations, the Center for the Study of Violence and Reconciliation South Africa, CSVR, and the Berkhof Foundation here in Berlin, together with partners in Malawi and the Philippines. Just a few words on how we in the Global Learning Hub came to look into the topic of today. For the past 4 years, the Global Learning Hub, with its network of 9 partner organizations, has promoted transformative approaches to transitional justice with a view to facilitating, enabling real change to the life of those communities most affected by violence, conflict, human rights violations, and other forms of injustice through prioritizing bottom-up approaches and community-led solutions, and a focus on addressing the root causes rather than just the symptoms of human rights violations and injustice. The transformative approaches to transitional justice allow for some outside of the box thinking beyond the standardized mechanisms of transitional justice, of conventional transitional justice, such as truth commissions or trials, on how to deal with those experiences while seeking lasting transformation in the present towards a more inclusive and just future. So linking past, present, and future is a key dimension of transformative approaches to transitional justice. And as we will see by the findings presented today, adopting such a transformative transitional lens to climate actions opens up new horizons for interpreting community-led actions to mitigate and adapt and to demand justice for climate harms. So linking both forward and backward-looking actions. And the perspective also identifies very productive entry points towards a more transformative global climate justice ecosystem. So I'm very excited that we have the different actors and organizations participating in this quite groundbreaking research present here today to share some of their key findings and make us all appetite to read the full publications later. As for the agenda, we will hear first from Jasmina Brankovic, a senior research advisor at the Center for the Study of Violence and Reconciliation in South Africa, about the conceptual framework upon which this research is based, before then turning to the findings of the two case studies, starting with the study on Malawi, presented by Jasmina, who authored the study together with local partners from the Civil Society Network on Climate Change, Glory Muva, and potentially also her colleague, Julius Ngoma. And then we move on to the second case study from Mindanao, the Philippines, presented by the two co-authors, Samuel Sontag, who is an activist and researcher in transitional justice, and Rima alongside, a researcher at the Mindanao State University. And then we will round up the discussions with a brief insight from Samuel on concrete entry points, so how to advance climate justice on the global level. Following the inputs, we have the opportunity for a short Q&A session for which you can already start using the Q&A function to post your comments and questions. We will monitor them and then try to answer as many as possible of them at the end. Without further ado, I hand over to Jasmina to start the session with a brief conceptual framework before leading us to the first case study on Malawi. Over to you, Jasmina, and very welcome.
Thank you so much, Johanna. It's wonderful to be here. Thanks for this space. So this work in many ways emerges from a book that climate expert Sonia Klinsky and I published in 2018. And that book shows how transitional justice ideas and mechanisms can help us address the legacies of past climate harms while building solidarity for climate justice in the present in order to lay the groundwork for a future with fewer or no more climate harms. And transitional justice is an established field, initially designed to deal with gross human rights violations committed in the past. It can be thought of in terms of 4 pillars. These are truth, reparation, accountability, and guarantees of non-recurrence. And looking at each in turn in the climate space, transitional justice can help generate a shared understanding and a record of how climate impacts lead to climate harms and who they affect and how. It can identify forms of material and symbolic reparation that adequately serve those most affected. It can create the conditions for state and non-state actors to take responsibility for addressing climate harms and also enable an institutional environment that mitigates those harms. And here I want to note that while the long-term consequences of climate change mean that climate impacts will continue, transitional justice can help curb climate harms, which are the avoidable injustices and suffering that result from those impacts. Over time, after the book came out, I was reflecting increasingly on the compounded injustices of climate change. And as we all know, while countries and communities in the global south generally contributed the least to greenhouse gas emissions, they tend to be the most affected by climate impacts and harms. And it became clear that to properly address these kinds of injustices, we need a more transformative transitional justice approach, which enriches the 4 pillars I mentioned earlier by prioritizing local experiences and solutions, particularly of those most affected by harms. It tackles historical injustices and inequality as root causes and amplifiers of the harms. It also acknowledges the continuum that often exists between past and ongoing harms today. So ultimately, transformative transitional justice goes beyond reform to try to challenge and shift power structures that maintain the inequalities that drive harms, as Johanna was mentioning earlier. And in this, it actually has many overlaps with climate justice practices. And I'm happy to report that there's already a precedent for a transformative transitional justice process for climate harms. At CSVR, we worked with communities affected by severe flooding and drought in South Africa. And using participatory methods, the members of these communities came together and co-designed and implemented a set of transitional justice measures, including a truth-telling process on climate harms, a commemoration event, and a physical memorial honoring all those affected by climate harms as a form of community-led reparation, and also advocacy for more participatory climate action planning, especially at the municipal level, which is linked to guarantees of non-recurrence. And given the wealth of community-led climate responses dealing with the past and ongoing harms that we found through this process in South Africa, which had not been documented before, I was thinking and wondering what other communities affected by climate harms are doing that could be read as transformative transitional justice. And then through the Global Learning Hub, we had a chance to partner with Berghoff and really explore this question across multiple contexts among colleagues, and as well as in relation to global climate policy architectures, as we'll hear later. So in the case of Malawi, we partnered with colleagues from Sisanek, including Glory, who's here, to conduct research with residents of Mkulambe, an area in the south of Malawi, which has been affected terribly by cyclones and tropical storms, along with everyday creeping climate change. And there are 3 findings from this research that I'd really like to highlight. So first, a transformative transitional justice lens provides a new way to look at and properly see the multifaceted and lasting nature of climate harms. So climate change is usually linked to, spectacular climate disasters and to economic climate impacts, related to things like infrastructure and property. But residents of Mkulambe also shared experiences of more profound and long-lasting climate harms in addition to those. So, for example, after Cyclone Freddy nearly destroyed the area a few years ago, many young people lost homes after having seen loved ones being taken away by floodwaters. They had limited access to education because school buildings were damaged or displaced persons were living in them. The water had destroyed school books and other school materials. Agriculture was affected to the point that many families didn't have the income to, for example, replace these materials. When the young people did go back to school, many dealt with hunger because of rising food insecurity in the community. Many struggled with trauma and mental health challenges every time, for example, it rained or a serious storm came along. And because graveyards were washed away, this affected cultural practices and relationships with ancestors that affected young people's well-being. So these are just some examples, and they're the types of climate harms that are usually not even seen, let alone acknowledged and addressed currently. And second, a transformative transitional justice lens reveals that affected communities value both backward-looking and forward-looking measures to address all of these types of climate harms. So what we saw in the area in Malawi, in addition to doing climate readiness and disaster preparedness and so forth, residents are also engaging themselves in truth-telling processes about climate harms, what they experienced in community governance structures through cultural and religious ceremonies, etc. They're also engaging in memorialization initiatives and community gatherings, and also using traditional and religious practices. And they're pushing for more participatory institutional reforms at the local, especially the local, but also the national level. And finally, a transformative transitional justice lens emphasizes the wealth of experience, knowledge, the resources that affected communities have access to. It emphasizes the climate responses and the solutions that they develop, which are often not seen or documented by climate practitioners and others who are more focused on other priorities. And these responses are contextualized. They are designed to meet the daily and concrete needs of those affected, and they address better the barriers to access and the barriers to implementation in ways that residents said are more effective than, state and often civil society climate actions locally. And importantly, they highlight the climate vulnerabilities, or the fact that climate vulnerabilities overlap with vulnerability to poverty, violence, and other challenges of marginalization. So these vulnerabilities exacerbate each other and thus need to be addressed together. So to close, ultimately, community level efforts exist, they're there, they will continue, and they will continue to have local value, whether they're widely recognized or not. However, residents did highlight the potential for linking these community-led climate efforts to national and international climate action in a collaborative way, and how this could create opportunities for cross-sectoral solidarity and an incentive potentially for powerful actors to take restorative responsibility for addressing climate change. And this effectively opens pathways towards transformation of power relations at a larger scale and has the potential to do that. And we'll talk about that more later. But for now, let me hand over to Glory for her reflections on community-led climate responses in Malawi and transitional justice.
Thank you, Jasmina. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everybody. As already introduced, my name is Glory Enchemuva, and I work with the Civil Society Network on Climate Change here in Malawi. And we supported the work, the research work that was done in Kulambe area in Palombe district, which is an area that has seen and has been exposed repeatedly to climate-induced disasters. The area, looking back to 1991, has experienced flash floods that nearly killed 700 to 1,000 people. And most recently, what Jasmina highlighted, Cyclone Freddy, which killed 67 people. And one of the significant contributions that the transformative transitional justice framework helps us understand or see when we're conducting the research was what constitutes or what is exactly climate-related harms or climate-induced harms. And through the community workshop that we conducted, as well as the focus group discussions that were conducted, community participants were able to highlight what constitutes harm to them. And these harms were mostly falling under what is referred to non-economic loss and damage. So there was loss of life, loss of cropland, as well as destruction of homes, hospitals, unintended pregnancies, the rise in child marriages because of issues to do with livelihood. So children want to get married early because they want find ways to sustain their livelihood. And like I already highlighted, many of these harms that the community participants highlighted were falling under an economic loss and damage, which mostly has to do with loss of identity, loss of culture, well-being, their social relations, how they relate with each other. Like Jasmine highlighted that during the Cyclone Freddy, houses were washed away and people were being washed away with them. And some people could actually see their family members being washed away and they could do nothing about it, which was really harmful and really sad. So the transformative transitional justice framework in our research with Jasmina really helped us to see that these are not isolated misfortunes. They don't just happen in isolation, no, but they form a broader injustice that is identifiable and the causes are seen. Unequal impacts are there, and the implications are extending far beyond the emergency response and humanitarian assistance that comes when climate disasters happen. Like in the case of Mkulambe, when Cyclone Freddy happened, there were a lot of institutions, organizations, both local and international, as well as even the government of Malawi, that came to help. But then the help only lasted for 3 months, as the community said. So we can see that there is need to go beyond just the 3 months because the people are still living in the harms that have been caused by climate-induced disasters. So community members really highlighted to us that despite the minimal institutional support that they were receiving, they developed some responses that could actually help them survive, that could help them thrive despite living in areas that are prone to climate disasters. So these responses that the community members developed really highlighted to us that they are mapping directly in the four pillars of transitional justice that Jasmina talked about. Because from what the residents told us, they are creating formal and informal, as well as cultural spaces to document their experiences. They're also sharing testimonies in those spaces and also preserving collective memory of what happened. I mentioned of 1991. You can imagine that one of the participants actually mentioned to us what happened then because their mother told them, their father told them. And also, it also makes sense to them of the recurring disasters that are happening in their community. So these processes, I would say that made their sufferings visible and traceable. They could actually trace that, okay, this is what happened to us when Cyclone Freddy happened. This is what happened to us when the 1991 flash floods happened. And they connect these experiences to the questions of responsibility. Now, who is responsible for this? And who is accountable for these climate-related disasters or harms? And how can they be redressed? And in doing so, we saw that Nkulambe community is already articulating climate justice not as an abstract policy concept, but as something that they are living in every day. And we saw the value of the need to use transformative transitional justice in climate justice claims. Because it provides a way to map the harms that happened and connect to the lived experiences of the community members and also connected to what is happening nationally as well as internationally. There are international platforms where these kind of harms and information can actually be talked about and be addressed or make people aware that something must be done. So it gives a visibility also and a legitimacy to the practices that are already existing also in the communities and that are often overlooked, as Jasmina highlighted, that are often overlooked by governments as well as the international institutions. So just to wrap it up, that our research also therefore suggests that the challenges is not the absence of climate justice. No, climate justice claims are already there, but rather the absence of meaningful connection between community-led responses and the broader system of decision making, as well as financing and accountability. And there's also the transformative transitional justice brings the opportunity to connect and build on this and strengthen the links that climate justice can have on communities aspirations and accountability. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Yasmina and Glory for sharing those insights and already pointing to the added value of linking transformative transitional justice framework and looking through this framework on local climate action and how it broadens our analysis and understanding and also helps us to give value to actions already underway on the local level. We will have time to probably pick out some of these points later and look into them a bit more in detail. But for now, I would like to hand over to Samuel Sontag and Rima alongside to present the findings from a similar case study carried out in Mindanao in the Philippines. Sam, over to you.
Thank you so much, Johanna, and thank you, Yasmina and Glory as well. So I'm just going to sort of quickly frame the study and the work that I did alongside Rimar, and then he'll present the details of the findings. But this study in Mindanao in the Philippines applied the same transformative transitional justice lens to a very different context. Mindanao has a long history of conflict and land-based marginalization dating back to the 16th century when Spanish colonization began. And this pattern involved a systematic displacement and erasure of indigenous Muslim Moro communities and non-Moro indigenous peoples and MIPs from their ancestral lands to make way for corporate extractive interests and Christian settlers onto lands that would ultimately be more climate vulnerable, floodplains, sloping hillsides that were prone to landslides. It's a pattern that was described in the 2014 Comprehensive Peace Agreement and the subsequent Transitional Justice Commission report as marginalization through land dispossession. And so for many, many decades, a separatist conflict between Moro groups and the Philippine state continued in Mindanao until a peace agreement, first in 2012 and then in 2014, cleared the way for the creation of the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region in Muslim Mindanao. But really, this region, the BARM, as it's called, is still in the middle of an unfinished transition. While the political change has progressed and the BARM itself has been established under local authority, the commitments to transitional justice have progressed very slowly. And the BARM has passed the Transitional Justice Bill as of January of this year. There's no equivalent yet on the national level. And so in this context of unfinished transition, despite the resolution of the conflict between Moro groups and the Philippine state, there's been a escalating cycle of intercommunity violence, renewed marginalization of non-Moro indigenous peoples who are now a persecuted minority in many respects under Bangsamoro rule. And at the same time, a growing climate crisis, increasing frequency of storms, of flooding, landslides, changes in rainfall patterns that are affecting communities across the BARM. And in this context, communities who are experiencing interconnected harms are approaching them in unison, are articulating visions of justice and pursuing justice actions that are not just integrating forward and backward looking dimensions across the four transitional justice pillars, but also combining justice for climate harms, for conflict, and for marginalization-based injustices into these braided practices that they articulate as indivisible and they argue are necessarily connected because this is the way that communities themselves experience these harms as interconnected, because of shared root causes in this legacy of land-based marginalization, that can't be disaggregated or disconnected if these challenges really are going to be resolved. And for non-Moro indigenous peoples, also because of a understanding of justice and the land as inherently indivisible. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Rimar Alonsagai, my co-author on the study and a researcher at MSU Marawi. Rimar.
Thank you, Sam, and good evening, everyone, and to our friends joining from other parts of the world. So some already mentioned about like situating the context in Bangsamoro region. Now I'll go ahead to zero in with some of the key findings from the research what that we had. One major findings that we have from the research is that the lived experience of the intersecting climate harms vis-a-vis political and social harm in Bangsamoro, like climate harm is not a discrete environmental problem, but part of a broader structure of unequal power relations that produce both ecological and social vulnerability of the communities that simultaneously produce material and cultural political. And one of the things is that the material harm includes like flooding, drought, landslide, livelihood collapse, and displacement. And these are not isolated events, but recurring conditions that reshape economic survival and physical security. And for the non-material harms, also extend the transformative transitional justice concerns with the dignity and recognition that captures the cultural loss and disruption of the indigenous peoples in terms of their knowledge system and practices, like erosion of spiritual relationships to their land and weakening of collective identity rooted in ancestral domain. And one of illustrative example of this is the landslide in Mount Mindanao, where indigenous peoples experience great huge displacement and epistemic exclusion. And another in terms of, we also look into the root causes and the structural drivers of the vulnerability that intersecting both transitional justice and climate harms in communities of Bangsamoro. uh, Understand the vulnerability that not a result of climate hazard alone, but as an outcome of a long-standing and interconnected injustices. Their experiences show that climate harms cannot be separated from historical conflict, exclusion, and unequal political and economic structure. So the central driver of this is the land disposition and resource extraction from the colonial land policies, settler expansions, logging and mining, and other extractive activities that reshape the access to land and resources. And we also look into how the communities visions justice. Um, Communities in Bangsamoro envision justice as transformative process rather than a fixed outcome. Their understanding of emphasizes participation, recognition, accountability, and structural change. And for that, we also focus on the community-led actions as a transformative justice practice. Because this is, I think, a core contribution of the research. The most significant analytical finding is that in the communities in Bangsamoro are not waiting for institutional transitional justice or climate governance responses. Instead, they are actively producing local justice infrastructures that embody transformative transitional justice principles in practice. These initiatives actually demonstrate these transformative transitional justice core prepositions that justice is primarily located in local agency, relational repair, and an ongoing practice rather than formal institutional completion. And one of the very analytical focus is the Project Bungkas. This is led by young people of Tiduray Lambangan young people that represents a concrete articulation of these transformative transitional justice in actions, where climate adaptations, cultural reclamation, and political recognition are integrated into a single justice practice. And one of that is that there is intergenerational, like, knowledge transfer functions as both climate adaptation and cultural repair, like ensuring transmission of indigenous knowledge system and practices, while also simultaneously repair, restoring disruptive relationship between generations that cause conflict and displacement. And we also did like climate walk operates a multidimensional justice practice involving truth telling and recognition and climate advocacy. So these are actually like from the perspective of transformative transitional justice, Project Mungkas provides, an illustrative how justice, emerges through from participatory, multi-layered community actions, and other also, broader community-led practices in across Bangsamoro. It also reflected, different forms of transformative justice practice that operates outside the formal institutions, like women-led response, women-led funds response, like community mapping and others. And I think I'll, pass to Sam, to provide some context on the institutional role.
Thank you so much, Rimar. And I'm noticing we're a bit behind schedule, so I'll try to keep this brief. But just first of all, these two studies and the community level actions that they identified suggest a broader universe of community climate action that bears further research and investigation, and suggests the potential for inter-community solidarity, knowledge sharing, and transmission of some of these approaches to addressing climate harms and injustices for communities that are similarly affected. And participants in both studies emphasize the necessity of community justice, both because of the insufficiency of institutional responses and because agency was an essential dimension of repair for communities that were systematically marginalized and excluded from decision-making spaces. They rejected a conception of resilience, a community resilience, as the role of affected peoples, just surviving and waiting for external help or demanding external help as advocates, and insisted on an active role. And they called for partnership with institutional actors. But they also recognized that those institutional actors were essential for real transformative justice on the local, on the national, and on the global scale. So the last part of this project was to look at those climate policy architectures and institutions on the national, regional, and global levels, and to apply a transformative transitional justice lens. And in doing so, we found something very different from what we saw on the community level. We didn't see sort of unnoticed justice action that was being carried out in these institutional spaces so much as dimensions of justice across the four pillars that were sort of latent in these processes, that had potential to be engaged and activated and to be connected into what we described as a broader climate justice ecosystem. So just very briefly, we looked at the truth content in advisory opinion processes on the international and regional levels, including the recent International Court of Justice advisory process, not just as judicial products that articulate normative standards, but also as processes where communities and affected countries can articulate their experiences and accounts of climate injustice. In terms of accountability, we looked at a growing set of potentially transformative tools in climate litigation that allow for more community responsive approaches to justice claims around climate, including the use of attribution science and predictive modeling tools for more granularized framings of harm that better reflect community experiences within judicial forums, the due diligence standard, which exists across international law, but that's been elaborated in the climate space, particularly in the ICJ's advisory opinion, to to allow for a sort of thicker conception of responsibility and remedies that are forward-looking, that demand prospective action of duty bearers, and the crystallizing human right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, which sort of pushes downwards to the individual rights holder level, the conversation about justice from sort of a default state level discourse. In terms of reparations, we looked at the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage, which is being operationalized now, and sort of asked whether it could embody a reparations process, given the restrictions on its actions under the Paris Agreement, Article 8, where an agreement of the parties restricts its use in expressing liability or compensation. And so thinking from a transformative transitional justice lens, we sort of thought of, by analogy to conditional amnesties and transitional justice processes, about whether this limiting condition could be in some ways enabling and allow sort of more expressive and symbolic forms of justice to be implemented through the fund without risking this fragile political balance because of this explicit wall between loss and damage action and liability. And then also thinking about this multi-level approach, whether organization or institutions on the national or subnational level could be supported through the fund to better address, receive, and respond to community claims. And finally, in terms of non-recurrence action, we looked at how through a transformative approach that sort of broadly looks at non-recurrence, not just as institutional reform, but as sort of the transformation of broader systems of injustice, at whether both climate institutions themselves could be changed to be more community responsive and transformative, and then also looking at mitigation and adaptation action as potentially embodying a commitment to non-recurrence. It's not a matter of rebranding. We're not arguing that by identifying these processes, that's the end of the story, that in some way accomplishes transformative transitional justice on a global scale, but rather that by identifying these processes and openings in these contested spaces, we can push for more justice-oriented, community-responsive approaches, and can connect these sort of limited justice elements into a broader ecosystem. So I'll stop there and hand it over to Johanna.
Thank you so much. First of all, thank you to both of you, Samuel and Rima, for giving us very quick insight into your findings in Mindanao, also highlighting the intertwined nature of different harms, both climate change related, but also closely interlinked with other political, structural and cultural systems of inequality and exclusion. And from that, also pointing out how communities already address those harms in quite an integrated manner, which, as you said, Rima, a transitional justice approach renders visible. And also, and now trying to round up also with the last input from you, Sam, then calls upon the infrastructural framework on climate justice, both nationally and globally, to actually pick up these ideas and notions and to see how the more latent justice content, as you said, which is not yet very clearly expressed, could become more pronounced and articulated within this infrastructure. Before asking you a bit more about what that now means for actually climate and transitional justice actors and institutions, and developing maybe some recommendations, there were a few questions in the chat which I would like to give back to the panel. And one of them was about actually what you saw when you did the research in both communities. To what extent did those communities actually look towards international actors for accountability and redress? How present was this expectation and claim also? who wants to go first? Jasmina, you're nodding. Would you like to go first?
Yes, I'd be happy to.
Thanks.
So in terms of this, very clearly, at least in Malawi, participants, the research participants and other residents, it was clear that for them, developed countries and corporations and those actors both have the responsibility for historical emissions and for addressing climate change today. So that was not really in question, but the focus was not really so much on prosecutions and other attributive forms of accountability. It was really more on restorative and reparative measures, and basically international actors learning from these processes that affected communities are putting in place, and really more supporting them and also collaborating with those communities to link local to global concerns. And they were very, at least in Malawi, there was a lot of discussion sort of around, how the government could work with local communities in a more participatory way so that they could improve their, climate responses across the country, including within the area where we were doing research. But then also in that way, if it's participatory, then the national climate responses would be reflected through things like the nationally determined contributions and other inputs that the Malawian government would be doing at the international level. It could, in that sense, reflect also at the international level through those pathways. So they linked the local and the global, level, at least some of the participants did. I think it's interesting, though, fundamentally, there was a focus on what the community could do itself. I think there was a kind of realism, and while there was a sense of the responsibility of the Malawian government and the international, let's say, community, people were really focused on what they could do themselves because that's what they could directly influence. Yes. And then I think I wanted to respond to another question here around sort of lessons that are beneficial for other practitioners in similar fields. And I would say, given, the changing geopolitical landscape and this kind of sense that we're heading towards a more interest-driven order, away from rules-based order and values-based, which I would argue that's been happening for a long time, since like the end of the 1990s, but nonetheless, there's a bit of a panic around it. And of course, there are funding issues involved. I think that what this research shows is how much is already happening on the ground that is not acknowledged and that is not even seen as something interesting because we don't have the right sort of lenses or the right ways to perceive what's happening. And I think that the future in many ways lies in seeing this and learning from it, and then also networks of stakeholders at different levels and scales connecting and coming together to influence global processes through these lessons. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Yasmina. Maybe Rima, from the research on the ground in Mindanao, what was their expectation of communities towards international actors in terms of accountability and redress?
Well, in the case in the Philippines is that I think they have the same perspective with Malawi in terms of like generally seeing international climate actors as an important but too distant and too slow compared to like the agency urgency to live climate impacts like typhoons, floods, and displacement. There is a strong of a sense of climate injustice. Communities emphasizes countries, and this shapes expectation of loss and damage, finance, but there's a gap between global agreements and local reality. Although like in the Philippines litigations, there is human rights inquiry. One is that in 2015, like Greenpeace Southeast Asia together with other environmental groups and human rights groups, supported like petition before the Commission of Human Rights to investigate responsibilities against like 47 major fossil fuel companies. So this is a good step. But in terms of the as your question about the international actors and international climate governance, it seems they see that it's important, especially these global climate threats and a climate crisis. But in terms of articulating this into local, they still see like immediate relief goods are still needed during typhoons. Displacements are most important rather than like litigations, prosecutions to institutions or even like the government.
And if I could just add one thing, is that participants in our study also emphasize it's not just a matter of whether institution or international actors should engage, but also how. And they were very critical of how some external engagement occurred, the ways that it sort of boxed communities into a certain passive role, often displacing activities and actions that were already happening on the ground, and sort of also encouraging sort of over time a more passive posture from communities. So they emphasize that in engagement, international actors as well as national and subnational actors needed to think about how to engage in such a way as to recognize pre-existing community agency and then also foster it.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Glory, would that also be a similar learning from the Malawian communities in your experience, or what would you say would be learnings that other communities could take from your experiences on the ground?
Thank you. I would say that it's similar to what everybody has said, but I want to highlight one thing, and that is just coming directly from the communities themselves. They want to be involved, despite asking for international actors to take responsibility in terms of accountability and redress. They want to be involved, and they want the solutions or responses to come directly from them, and then the international actors, the government themselves, can take it up. So they are looking for a more below and ground up to kind of response to climate related disasters.
Thank you. Yeah, and maybe that brings us to a last round of recommendations as well, picking up on a question that was also posed in the Q&A section of the chat from Robert from the Academy for Conflict Transformation within Pro-Peace, basically asking for learnings and insights for practitioners in the field. So how could we all working in the field and related fields actually support this kind of stronger connection that you just referred to, Glory, to allow for more permeability, but also greater participation and visibility of those local initiatives, actions, and perspectives? What would you recommend? And maybe taking it one step further, also, are there some major mechanisms or instruments that people could refer to in advocating for a stronger integrated justice response? Sam, that's a question maybe also to legal references, but also political processes that you would like to highlight in this context that people could plug in to strengthen this kind of connecting and integrating work.
Okay, so I would say that before coming up with projects, before probably speaking on behalf of communities at the global stage, there need to be community mapping to actually understand what the communities are going through, what is exactly it is that they indicate as harm. What is it exactly that they indicate as a response or as a solution to their problems? So that instead of just bringing something that is totally off, you bring something that is actually needed in the communities. I think that can actually be the recommendation that I can put across. Thank you.
I can add something. But this is so in terms of sort of where to look for support. One thing that our research surfaced was that in some of these cases there was the potential for sort of intermediary or mediating spaces that communities' own articulations of justice and approaches to justice are often quite different from the approaches of institutional actors. And in some ways, that's not just a failing of institutions, although it is that, but also it's in the nature of institutions that they're going to be focused under a specific mandate that maybe isn't as contextually rich as communities' own experiences. And in some ways, the higher up you go, the further from communities you go, the more that's the case. And so in that regard, it's worth looking at institutional spaces that that either explicitly attempt to sort of mediate between these levels. So one example that we looked at is the Local Communities and Indigenous Peoples platform within the UNFCCC ecosystem, which does exactly that. It connects with local communities and indigenous peoples, and with state parties and policymakers, and brings them together in spaces where it's not just a matter of sort of scaling up a highly contextualized community approach or imposing an institutional one, but of sort of co-creating justice approaches together. And then I think that sort of the other category of institution is just simply institutions that are in terms of their position on the subnational level, sort of closer to communities and are able potentially to mediate between sort of received community claims and community engage with community actions as well as other institutions. So we looked in our study, Remar and I, at the newly formed Bangsamoro Transitional Justice and Reconciliation Commission as at least potentially one of these spaces where they might be capable of receiving community claims that braid together elements of post-conflict marginalization linked and climate linked justice, and then sort of bridge to narrowly mandated institutions on the Bangsamoro level, and then also on the national and potentially even international level.
Thank you very much, Sam. Rima and Yasmina, would you like to add one last recommendation before we have to close the session? Each of you?
Yeah, sure. Just a quick because I've been reflecting this because I've been working like for 14 years in a grassroots local organizations, and we did a lot of climate justice works and with non-Moro indigenous peoples and other young peoples in Bangsamoro. I think one thing that we can put forward is the integration of the local knowledge and practices in the policy making at all levels, from the local to national to the international, because I think that's something missing in the process. We see that the policy is very technocratic, very technocratic, very elite centered process and structures. Major missing is that the lived experiences, like the indigenous people already have in place traditional systems towards climate mitigation adaptation, and that's something other people could learn from the indigenous people. And we need that space. We need this space to sustain for intergenerational campaign towards climate justice. That's it.
Great. And I would just add that I think what this research shows is that there are already processes happening on the ground in the climate space, which could be read as transitional justice, both backward looking and forward looking, linking past and ongoing harms and addressing them. And so there are these processes that need to be paid attention to, that should be acknowledged and learned from. And also there are entry points in the global policy, climate policy architectures that provide a pathway towards more transformative climate justice viewed through this transformative transitional justice lens. So this is not something new that needs to be created. That's actually there already. And it provides a new, as you said, Johanna, out of the box way of thinking about the challenges that we're facing, which are many and profound, but we're facing them together.
Thank you very much to the four of you for these very inspiring recommendations and food for thought at the end that I think we can all take with us, be it we're working in the field of transitional justice, peace building, or climate and environmental issues. So I think, thank you for also the innovative creativity that all of you put into this research collaboration. I think it really moves the two fields forward and shows the usefulness of looking beyond disciplinary or sectoral boundaries. With that, I would also reach out to the audience and thank you for the interest in listening in today and staying here with us 3 minutes after the scheduled end. And I would like to encourage you to click on either the link here in the chat, which directly brings you to the 3 publications, or look for them further down on the website of the Transitional Justice Hub or the Brokaw Foundation. And let's all get inspired by the very, very interesting findings that you will find there, and food for thought for our future work. With that, I thank all of you and happy evening, good day to everyone.